All right, welcome to TCC 101.
You still have the accent going.
Yes, I've been messing with Jack with a, is it Irish or Scottish? I think it's Scottish.
A mix. It's a mix.
I feel like it's mainly Scottish.
Probably mainly Scottish, but I feel
so
like
I figure since he's in charge of this one, I figure I'd just throw him off his game with the accent, because he had a triumphant beginning yesterday in the pulpit. And I don't want him to get too big for his wee britches.
A triumphant beginning. Wow. That's saying something.
All right, so welcome to TCC 101, and we're glad that you're joining us. Yes. We are picking up, we took a week off, and we are also continuing to take off the mornings. We're not doing the morning prayer broadcasts, just to give us kind of a break and to help us get prepared for the fall. Mm-hmm. But what we're doing now for TCC 101 is we're telling the background story, the family tree of Turner Christian Church. So last time we talked about the worldwide church. Today, Jack is going to talk about the situation for the church in America and how that led to this unique movement called the Christian churches, or the Restoration Movement, or the Sun Calendar. There's a lot of names for it, but it's all the same thing. Yeah. And then next time, which is 2 weeks from now, we're going to get together and we're going to talk about the history of this congregation specifically. So, as you're watching, if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them up as comments on the video, and we will do our best to answer them. Other than that, I'm going to sit back, retreat into my Scottish accent, and I'll let you take over so they can hear what you have to say.
Well, before you do that, since it's been 2 weeks, can you do like a brief recap of what we talked about 2 weeks ago?
I suppose. All right, so last time we talked about how the church, over time, in order to protect itself from heresies, from different theologies that were coming up, and because as it got intertwined with the Roman Empire, started to define itself with creeds and with rules about what real Christians believed and what they didn't. And as they did more of these councils and more of these creeds, the church began to splinter. And so over time, you ended up with the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church. There's also the Coptic Church and a couple other small ones that people aren't really aware of anymore, mainly because they were focused in areas that were taken over by Islam. And then those two movements also splintered. So you had the Eastern Orthodox movement break up into different national churches. So you had the Greek church, you had the Russian church, you had the Ukrainian church. And because Russia and Ukraine are in conflict, the Russian church and the Ukrainian church are in conflict. And then in the West, you have the Catholic Church, and then you have all of the Protestant or non-Catholic churches. And for most of history, those different churches each had their own territory. So the whole country would either be Catholic or Protestant. In Germany, it was a mix, but that's because some of the states in Germany were Catholic and some of them were Protestant. But basically, you were part of whatever church the government was a part of. So England was Episcopalian, Scotland was Presbyterian, France was Catholic, Spain was Catholic, Switzerland was Reformed, and the Netherlands was Reformed, and then you got Denmark is Lutheran, most of the Scandinavian countries are Lutheran. So the point is, where we left off, you have the Western, or the world, the church, really broken up in these different national churches, and what kind of Christian you were depended on what country you were in.
Yeah, and so kind of with that, when people came to the New World, when they came to America, they settled it in colonies, and they had these specific kind of sets of people groups around, mainly in the East, and they all kind of each had their individual Christian sect in a way. They had their own kind of individual Christian religion because they were all from different countries, and because their different countries were practicing different religions. That's what they knew. And when they came to the New World, they stayed in those colonies with each other, and that's where the religions were. And so you had different religions, such as the Quakers, the Dutch Reformed, Anglicans, Baptists. You had all these different religions kind of all around the East in different colonies. And so there were a lot of Christian branches in a lot of different colonies. And because of this, their practices were often similar to what the practices were in their countries that they were from. And so there were subtle differences, obviously, because they were coming and they were kind of individualizing their religion in a sense. But there was still often that what they knew was what they practiced. I mean, you have to imagine it'd be hard, going from here, turning a Christian church and traveling to another country and settling in another country and building houses and markets and whatever it might be, and still developing a whole new religion. Like, that would just be, there's a lot on your brain, there's a lot on your mind, and so that's going to be a really hard thing to do. So they just kind of remained practicing what they had known for their entire lives. And so kind of what ended up happening out of that is that there were a lot of people who didn't feel like their religion was personal, didn't feel like they had a personal relationship with Jesus. They didn't feel like they could talk to Jesus, because for so long they had been told, no, you need to do that through a priest. You need to do that through a minister. That's their job. They are kind of the go-between you and God. And so that's what they had known. And so for a long time in those colonies, that's what they had as well. Is they were like, okay, we need a minister to do kind of the in-between us and God. And so people kind of started to drop out of the faith. They started to drop out of churches in a sense, and started to kind of turn away from Christianity. And so kind of what we're going to be focusing on today is talking about these things called the Great Awakenings. And the first one happened around the 1730s and 1740s. And so this is definitely the most significant one. I would argue, this is kind of where our country began to form its ideas, in a sense. It's difficult to talk about the beginnings of America without talking about the beginnings of Christianity. And I think that sometimes can create this interwovenness of politics and Christianity, which is a rocky road sometimes. And it's very difficult to discern, where do my politics and my faith line up? Where do they come together? And maybe that's a whole nother episode of yep. Not TC 101, but deleted scenes or whatever we might have, because there's a lot that goes into that. But so many believers, they didn't have a person of faith. And so this first Great Awakening really focused on this idea of personal faith, of people being able to just talk to Jesus and to actually read the Bible, and to make their faith their own, in a sense. And so I kind of have a list here of some of the themes of the first Great Awakening.
Just to be clear, so the Great Awakening was a revival.
Yes.
That happened where a bunch of tent preachers and things like that. So
yeah.
If you're familiar with tent preaching and revivals, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And so some of these themes are that all people are born sinners, then sin without salvation will send a person to hell. All people can be saved if they confess their sins to God, seek forgiveness, and accept God's grace. All people can have a direct and emotional connection with God, and religion shouldn't be formal and institutionalized, but rather casual and personal. And so one of the things that I wanted to bring up is, I heard this one time in a class, and I think it was actually Christianity in America that I took in college. Christianity and religion as a whole can often be looked at as a pendulum. Right? It swings to one side and it swings to the complete other side. And so that's essentially what's happening. All these people, they had experienced a certain type of faith, and it was institutionalized, and it was directly affiliated with their government, and whatever the government believed is what the people believed. And so now they're swinging to the complete other side, saying, no, this is intensely personal. This is your own faith. This is between you and Jesus. And so that's kind of what ended up happening in the Great Awakening, in the first Great Awakening. And yet, as you said, a lot of tent preachers, so some people call them circuit riders. And so, that's just the idea of, like, you had you have Pastor Matt, and what he does is he just travels around to different churches and preaches in them, because towns oftentimes couldn't really afford, or just people weren't educated enough to have ministers in their specific towns, and so they'd have this cycle that they'd go on and preach. And so these things would often be called revivals. And so this had some really positive effects. It also had some negative effects, but some of the positive effects definitely are, it started to create more unity, in a sense, between churches around it. It didn't essentially just mix them. That wasn't completely what happened, but people started to realize we all follow Jesus. And I mean, because that was the most essential part of the Great Awakening, is do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? This is a personal faith. And then some of the negative aspects that kind of came out of that is people started to, with that pendulum swinging to the other side, in order to be saved, some people started to believe that you have to have a conversion experience. If you haven't had a conversion experience, you're not saved. And so essentially what a conversion experience is, it's one of those moments in your life where this crazy thing happened, and God saves you from that. Maybe a tree falls and it just misses you, and so God saves you, and you're like, okay, I need to commit my life to Christ. That's a conversion experience. And if you hadn't had that, maybe you're 75, you haven't had that conversion experience yet, you're not saved. And so some people started to believe that with that pendulum swing, because for so long it had been the complete opposite of that. And so that's kind of what we see with the Great Awakening, and this kind of, this idea of bringing people together in a sense in the United States. This is where the country kind of started to become unified. It wasn't exactly a country yet, but a lot of scholars believe that this first Great Awakening led to the Revolutionary War. Like that people started to come together, even though they were still Anglicans and Quakers and whatever they might be. They still said this is a personal faith, and we all follow Jesus, even though we're all different and we believe different things, but we all want to be America. And they didn't have America yet, but they all wanted to be free from whatever was over in Europe. And so they came together, and that kind of birthed the Revolutionary War. And so, and then some other things that kind of came out of that. It also led to some colleges being founded. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't, but Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, and Rutgers, colleges like that, were all kind of birthed out of this first Great Awakening. And so, that happened around the 1730s to 1740s, and really just one of the most significant, I think, historical aspects of yes, our Christian movement, but also as a country. So I think that's just a really cool thing to look at. Anything to add or subtract so far?
So a really big part of the First Great Awakening, like you were saying, was the conversion experience. You had to have this kind of emotional experience, and so that's where they don't have these as much anymore. But you may have heard of a mourner's bench. They would set up a bench at the front of the church, and they would preach until you had an emotional response. It's actually kind of similar to some of the ways when Pentecostalism is abused. It can kind of be abused this way, just hitting people as hard as you can to get them to have an emotional experience. So they'd have people over in the front having these emotional experiences, and they would preach in order to try and force you to do that. If you studied, you may have heard in school, the only sermon people study in public school, it's sinners in the hands of an angry God. And that's the exact kind of preaching where he just rails on how terrifying it is to be in danger of hell. And his goal was to make you have an emotional breakdown and throw yourself on God's mercy because you had to do that in order to become a Christian. And that was really a pushback against this old world idea that you're a Christian based on your citizenship in a country. And so in the New World in America, where you have all these different competing churches, they would say, no, you're not a Christian just because you're a citizen of a country. You have to have this personal experience. So the pendulum super swung to one way, and then they would just bash you over the head trying to make you have an emotional experience. And that's where the mourner's bench comes from.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So yeah, the next significant event that we're going to talk about is the Second Great Awakening, which that happened around the 1790s to 1800s, and so that's obviously after America, Revolutionary War, all that stuff happened, and so the Second Great Awakening, it shared some similarities in content that was happening, and they still were having different preachers that were traveling around preaching at different things, and they were having revivals still, and so. This is the time where our movement, the Restoration movement, that's where that began. It began with Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone and guys like that. And these were some of the guys that were traveling around preaching. And Barton W. Stone actually has one of the more popular revivals that happened, the Cane Ridge Revival, which that was a several-day revival that happened, and he preached to somewhere around 20,000 people. And so.
Just a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. And so, I just thought about that, and I was like, wow, 1,800, like 20,000 people. That's crazy.
And no amplification. Without a microphone.
Yeah. Oh, man. Bart W. Stone, I wish I could meet that guy, because he must have a really loud voice or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, but yeah, we'll dig really deep into that a little bit later in our series, I think. But yeah, so that was where the Restoration movement was officially born, and so this is kind of where you started to see some other different Christian movements happening too, but also still having some of the mainline denominations continuing, Baptists, Anglicans, Presbyterians, people like that, and actually the Campbells, Thomas and Alexander, and Barton W. Stone were all Presbyterian ministers, and then ended up starting the Restoration movement because they just wanted to see the church go back to New Testament values and just see this unity of like, yeah, we understand that we might interpret the Bible a little bit differently, but we are all under one banner, and that's Jesus Christ, and so we need to come together as Christians. And so that's kind of where that began. And but church membership, it skyrocketed again. So what was happening before the first Great Awakening was, people were dropping out of churches because they didn't feel this personal connection, and they were no longer required to do so. And then once revival started happening, first Great Awakening happens, church membership skyrockets, and then it kind of keeps going up, and then it kind of teeters off a little bit, and then it starts to dip down, and then you have second Great Awakening, and it skyrockets again. And so that's why they're called the Great Awakenings, is because you see this huge rise in Christian church membership, and it kept extending on into the frontier, and kind of how America was extending. In a sense, it was extending with it too. And so circuit riders kept going further and further and further and further, and more established civilizations in the East, we're seeing more and more, Christian membership and everything. So, but yeah, and all the while we're still seeing, Baptist churches and Anglican churches and churches like that. They're growing too still, and so. And then, so in the idea with the pendulum swinging again, you have the pendulum swing all the way over, and then you have the pendulum kind of swing into the middle a little bit, and then it's kind of crazy some of the stuff that happens. But into the 1900s, in the late 1900s, we see a lot of different movements happen that are results of different things that have happened before. And so you see things like the holiness movement happening, where, kind of birthed out of these revivals, some things that were being taught in the holiness movement was that, you were baptized by the Spirit. And so instead of having these conversion experiences, or instead of having to be baptized or anything like that, you're baptized by the Spirit simply when you accept Christ, and then you're able to perform spiritual gifts. You're able to prophesy and to speak tongues and things like that, and to heal the sick. And so kind of what ends up happening is, for so long we saw a lot of denominations and a lot of specific church movements happening, and then in the late 1900s you see this kind of just extend out, and then all of a sudden you have non-denominational churches who are just fully independent, and you have mega churches that start popping up too. And so, right, we kind of just really jumped ahead from the Second Great Awakening, and there's the Third Great Awakening and the Fourth Great Awakening are kind of things that are contested as to whether they actually are Great Awakenings, but there's a lot of things that happen within those times that kind of indicate that there was somewhat of a Great Awakening, and we see that with non-denominational churches and mega churches and things like that, which were kind of birthed out of this idea, the church was still growing, and so mega churches, in big areas, they just saw growth. And some churches even started off as really small churches, and people just kept going and going and going, and all of a sudden you have these big churches that see a lot of people attending. And so, but all the while you still see these mainline denominations, such as Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. They're still seeing growth too. I mean, there's a lot of Baptist churches that we see that are huge churches. I know in Eugene, driving from Marcola onto Coburg Road in the Sheldon area, you look to your right, you see First Baptist of Eugene, huge building. Mm-hmm. And you're like, whoa, that must be a lot of people that go there.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of this idea as, the United States just kept growing. There kept being more and more people. The church kept growing too. And there's just these different sections of time where different things kind of lead to this skyrocket of church membership, and then it kind of, peaks and then kind of dips down and then skyrockets again, or whatever it might be. And you just have a lot of movements that were born out of, swing to that side. We don't like that, swing to that side. And then you have just more and more church movements. And so,
So one of the things that you can see when you come to one of our worship services, you can see our tradition's roots in the Second Great Awakening. Because we talked about how the pendulum swung all to this side where you have to have an emotional response. In order to be a Christian, you have to be able to point to that moment when you had an emotional response. And when the pendulum swung over to the Second Great Awakening, you had a lot of people saying, and especially Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone and Thomas Campbell saying, no, you don't have to manufacture an emotional experience. Because having faith and hearing the word and accepting the word, the way the Bible talks about becoming a Christian is actually rooted in some mental, intellectual responses too. You have to obey God. You have to make a choice to obey. And so the point isn't this emotional reaction, it's to make a decision. And that is why Christian churches traditionally end the service with an invitation. Because we don't think that you have to have an emotional crisis in order to become a Christian. That's oftentimes God reaches us during an emotional crisis. But responding to the gospel is a decision to obey God. And anytime you hear the word of God preached, you have the opportunity to respond to that. And so if you've ever wondered why we have an invitation every single Sunday, that's because of our roots in that movement and that mentality that you don't have to manufacture an emotional state in order to become a Christian. You have to make a decision to obey. And then the way the pendulum swung back the other side is the one that the people talk about a third and fourth great awakening, and nobody agrees on what to call them. But the most frequent one that's identified as the third great awakening is the Azusa Street Revival, which is what started Pentecostal movements. And again, you see this reaction to the intellectual ascent, where some churches would go so far as to make faith strictly an intellectual, mental, these are the facts I believe, therefore I'm going to heaven. And they reacted and said, no, there does need to be a personal, emotional investment. And then the pendulum swung way over to the side of, again, when it was used incorrectly or used excessively, it would be emotional manipulation. So each of these different parts, they have a very important thing that they're contributing to the church, a very important insight that the other side of the pendulum has lost. They also have a temptation to take it too far and say something weird. Yeah. Which has happened on our side as much as any other side of the pendulum.
It's kind of this result, and maybe you've heard this idea of the United States kind of being a melting pot, right? It's this idea that so many different cultures and backgrounds can come to this country and live and thrive and be. It's the same with, just Christianity as a whole. It's a melting pot of Christianity. And so, on one corner of the street, you're going to have a church that, is a Baptist background. And then on another corner of the street, you're going to have a Christian church with Restoration Movement background. And that's not saying, okay, that's my corner, this is my corner, that's your corner, just stay there, don't interact. No, you can interact. I mean, it's just a case of, this country is built and founded on so much of that idea of being a melting pot, and Christianity is not immune to that idea. And there's so many different times in the life of Christianity in America where the pendulum has swung and swung back, and it's kind of been in the middle for a little bit of a period of time. And so you just have this result of so many different churches and so many different backgrounds, because there are so many different churches from different European countries and different Eastern countries that have now come and made their home here in the United States. And so it's just kind of this interesting mesh of different beliefs and different ideas of what the Bible says that just have all culminated here. And it's just, I think it's really cool to look at and just to see, like, wow, this is what this resulted from, and this is what this resulted from, and so there's a lot that we could talk about right now. That's kind of like what I have to share with you. So if there's any questions that maybe we could more specifically talk about, then feel free to shoot those questions our way. And I'm sure Pastor Matt will be willing to help me out if I don't know the answer to a question.
Yep.
So
feel free to send us a question if you have one. While we're waiting to see if any questions pop up, I'm going to make just a little segue to connect this with the three-part series. So what Jack has been talking about with these awakenings and all these really unique movements that were happening in America, the reason why they were happening and being triggered in America and why there was so much religious fervor in America rather than other places is because you had people mixing from all these different religions that normally didn't talk to each other. Like, we don't understand this anymore, but there used to be, like, if you were German, if you were Swiss Catholic, or not Swiss, Swedish Catholic, and you came over to America, you went to a Swedish, I said Catholic. Let me start over. If you were Swedish Lutheran and you came over to America, you went to a Swedish Lutheran church. You did not go to a German Lutheran church, because even though you're both Lutheran, you've also got national rivalries and all these different things. You didn't want your Swedish kids marrying those German kids and all these different stuff. So there were huge barriers between all these different churches when they came over to America. And because we're this melting pot, they're being mixed together. And that's where Thomas and Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone, they looked around and said, well, why can't I do church with those people over there? That they wouldn't have mixed with them in Scotland, where they came from, but in America, they're with all these other types of Presbyterians, not to mention Baptists and Methodists, and so they started asking, why can't we work together? And so America was this unique place where it triggered these questions, and it triggered, forced the church to deal with all the splinters that had happened.
Yeah, and one thing I would say with that, I've had conversations with friends about this where, sometimes we look at, Alexander Campbell and Thomas Campbell and Barton W. Stone and see them as kind of the beginnings of this movement. And that can sometimes cause us to be like, oh wow, those guys are so amazing. But one thing that you said that I really like is it kind of resulted out of the situation that was happening here. As much as those guys were like, yeah, we want, those were the questions they were asking, it also was just kind of a result of the situation that was happening in America. And so, not to, idolize those guys, but just say, it's kind of just, those were the natural questions that started to come up, and they were kind of the guys that took those questions and ran with them in a sense. It would have happened at some point, if it had happened 100 years before, 100 years after, I'm sure someone would have had the same questions, and then we have those names as the beginning of that movement. So, as much as they are great guys and they did start the movement, we just need to be careful about idolizing them, I think, sometimes.
Well, that's one of the really cool things about the Christian church movement is that it actually started, rather than starting in one place, it started from like 6 or 7 different groups that all got the same idea. They looked around at the church being divided in America, and how they couldn't get along with other Christians. And they said, "This is wrong." And they ended up, because they were committed to uniting the church, as they found other churches doing the same thing, they would unite with those churches. And so our movement was actually founded by groups getting together that have gotten similar ideas completely independently.
Yeah.
So I like that point, that hopefully it would be inevitable that Christians would look around in a place like America with all these churches intermixing and say, we shouldn't be divided. Like, hopefully that would be inevitable.
Yeah.
And they just happen to be the ones who said it. Or who wrote it down and people liked the way they wrote it.
Yeah, right.
All right. We're not seeing any questions so far, so we'll give you a couple more minutes to throw in some questions if you have them. Let me double check to make sure that so next time we're going to be talking about a little bit more about where the Christian church movement came from specifically. And then we're going to talk about how it came over to Oregon on the Oregon Trail, because our church tradition is actually really closely tied with the Oregon Trail, which is cool. And then we will talk about this particular congregation and our history in this area.
So the next installment will be 2 weeks from now. Yes,
2 weeks from now, because I'm going to be on vacation, and I'm not going to make Jack do this all by his onesie. So, meet us back here in 2 weeks for the next episode of TCC 101. And, Jack's going to be preaching again this Sunday.
Yeah.
So join us for that. He's going to be talking about just a little Psalm 119.
Yeah. I think it's like the shortest psalm.
Yeah, it's not very long.
Yeah,
no. Just a little bit. Anyway, so join us for that. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks on TCC 101 and this Sunday in church. So you want to sign us off?
Yep. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Amen. See you later.